This is an abridged session. It's very short, but we did want to have this opportunity to introduce our new members, and we of course invite everyone for the reception afterwards. Thank you very much.
If I can speak from here, I would appreciate it. It's been a very long day, and I'm also jet lagged because I had to fly in from Switzerland. So for me, it's now well past midnight European time. So please forgive me. So we have a bit of a PowerPoint here. So I will try to go through it as quickly as I can and explain also why I chose this topic. As some of you know, I was born in the city of Odessa, and Odessa also is a city with a very important role in Ukraine's past and in Ukraine's present. It is a city which also has a lot of complicated mythologizing narratives about it, and that is something that we need to address. So as you already see on the slide there, it's a city that is considered to be a city on the edge of a diverse, as we would argue, or divided, as enemies of Ukraine would argue, Ukraine. And it's a city that is cosmopolitan in many senses, and a city liminal, that is on a threshold. A port city between the sea and the steppe, and a city in love with its past, and usually is analogized to other port cities with a prominent past, like Trieste, the former main port of the Habsburg Empire, or say Alexandria. Also, the context of the war, the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, made us challenge the old imperial optics of approaching the city, and we need to address both the present and the past as we do that, and confront the legacies of injustice towards it. Like the rest of Ukraine, Odessa surprised many global observers after February 2022. You see here two photos that are made in Russian so that the invaders could read them, but who stayed very firmly in Ukrainian colors. Odessa is Ukraine. And since the Russian mythologizing discourse like to talk about Odessa as Odessa Mama in sort of a criminal slang mythology, if anybody dares to touch Mama, Mama will bury them. And we see the Russian warship doing what it's supposed to do. And you cannot see at the bottom right where you see the statue of Duke de Richelieu, who was the mayor of Odessa in the early 19th century. It says 3 pampers to Russian soldiers. But next slide, please. But yes, that is the problem that we have, is that we had a lot of myths and stereotypes about Odessa. I apologize for this slide, which is a still from the notorious Russian TV series Liquidation, which had a complete unrealistic narrative, sort of glorifying simultaneously both the criminal world and the Soviet brave, police officers in the immediate aftermath of the war, but presented the city primarily as a Russified place dominated by Jewish people, but Jewish people presented in a caricature, anti-Semitic way. And unfortunately, up to the full-scale invasion, a lot of local tourist industry also perpetuated those myths. We very often would go to see places of this famous criminal from the late 19th century or that famous criminal from the early 20th century, as if the city's culture had nothing to do with that. And unfortunately, this has also been done by many Western scholars, and we have some examples. Here's the next slide. Covers of 2 books about the city. On the right, Tales of Old Odessa, Crime and Civility in a City of Thieves. City of Thieves without quotation marks. On the cover is the famous opera house. Odessa is known for being a city that has its main landmark, not a cathedral, not the city hall, not a castle, but the opera house. So the opera house must be one of those dens of thieves that they're talking about. The other one, the city of rogues and schnorrers. Russia's Jews and the myth of old Odessa. And as my friends who are better knowledgeable in Yiddish than I tell me, Schnorrer is a pretend beggar. Somebody who says, woe is me, my house is gone, I'm penniless, but who is in fact a pretender, a liar. So that's also not a very flattering characteristic of the city. If you look at the book on the right, the Tales of Old Odessa, and searching it for the word Ukraine, it does not appear even once. The word Ukrainians appears only once in the phrase the anti-Semitic Russians and Ukrainians. This is the presentation we had in what was considered serious scholarly publications, and these books actually won awards, believe it or not. We're fortunate that there are very serious attempts at bringing nuance, and here are some of the examples. One of them is Patricia Herdicke, who was a wonderful historian who for a long time, until her passing away, taught at Brown University. She was the first Western scholar to come to Odessa to work in local archives and bring the truth about the city's history. Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute published her seminal book on the history of Odessa from the end of the 18th century to the start of World War I. This book here is a book that was compiled while she is still alive, but unfortunately saw the light already a few weeks after her passing, and it collects her various essays on Odessa from the early 70s until the end of her life. On the right, we see a book by the Canadian-based geographer Tanya Richardson, Kaleidoscopic Odessa History and Place in Contemporary Ukraine, which is a book that precisely introduces nuance. And I love its cover because it gives us early 19th century vernacular architecture, buildings that are 200 years old but are not glamorous, and you see the same style of building falling apart, attempting to restore, and covered in the Soviet cement to make it gray and boring and invisible. All of that is present simultaneously. Odessa city center, which is the largest area in Ukraine of historic buildings from before World War I, was finally recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Center only in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion had begun. And it was heavily bombed in Russia several occasions. The heaviest was in July 2023, of which you see the two photos here, including the direct damage to the cathedral. But it has been continuously shelled, including damage to the Fine Arts Museum. They didn't hit the museum building itself, but they hit right next to it with very serious consequences. So we have all those tensions, and to try to resolve those tensions, I propose, and this is what I argue has been happening in the city, is using the paradigm of multidirectional memory. Multidirectional memory is a concept introduced by Michael Rothberg, who is now a professor at UCLA, and noted a scholar of both anti-Semitism and colonialism and of Holocaust history, who argued, and this is a very busy slide, you don't have to read it, I'm just going to summarize, that usually, especially in the minority competitions, memories are seen as crowding each other, that we have a competition of victimhood, that different communities say, I'm the most oppressed, no, I'm the most oppressed, I suffered the most, no, I suffered the most. And he was arguing to find the things that we have precisely been talking about today early in our general meeting. Initiatives like the late Professor Taras Bunjak, or my wonderful colleague next to me, Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, that actually foster dialogue across the divides, and a lot of very important work has been done, rejecting this zero-sum logic in approaching memory politics. And that leads us to look for complex acts of solidarity, to look for ways that we create new communal and political identities. And it's not a predetermined process. It's a difficult journey, but we have to try to look for the work of how that has been done. And it's very dark subject matter we're talking about. Just like Rothberg's book is about the Holocaust and the legacy of colonialism and slavery, similarly, in the case of Ukraine, we have a lot of past oppression and injustice, and different communities can bridge those legacies to talk together and actually in acts of empathy and solidarity. And so rejecting two assumptions that a straight line leads from memory to identity, and that the only kinds of memories and identities that are therefore possible are the ones that exclude elements of alternative form of commonality of others, we can create new forms of solidarity and new visions of justice. Next slide. We have, of course, in Ukraine, excellent example, sorry for the low-case typo for Professor Hnatyuk, multidirectionality explored in Lviv. A wonderful book, Courage and Fear, by Ola Hnatyuk and by Katarzyna Koteńska, Lviv, the Reading the City Anew. So these are both scholars based in Poland, but great friends of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture that precisely look in the Rothbergian way of interlacing these complex memories in public space and looking through that entanglement in productive, constructive ways. And what is done in Odessa? We have, in the aftermath of 2014, a very serious development of dialogue, but also practical steps. We have to undo old mythology imposed by Russia and the Soviet Union. One of the ways of undoing it is actually, you see here, volunteer work at the cemetery within the city limits that has graves from the 1770s. Of course, the Russian official mythology is that Catherine II founded Odessa in 1794, where there was nothing. Of course, there was something there because the Russian troops that captured the Turkish fortress went to a Greek tavern to celebrate. If there was a Greek tavern to celebrate, there was clearly a city large enough to support a tavern that could accommodate a command of officers doing that. And these are Ukrainian graves of the so-called Kozaki Norubai that were allowed to settle in those lands as long as they gave up their weapons. That's why one of the main centers of stone masonry and catacombs near Odessa is called Norubaisky, because there was the village of Kozaki Norubai. So there's a lot of new historical research. And if you look at the next slide, 200, 600, and more than 2,000 years old. On the left, you see that right on Primorsky Boulevard, in the very center of Odessa, we have Greek ruins that have been uncovered. So there was Greek presence there well over 2,000 years ago. But we have a continuity of a modern city going on since early 15th century. Since 1415 is the first documented one. So we really need to shed reliance on those old Russian Empire imposed narratives. And this is...
Homer was born in Homer was born.
Of course, not you. All right. And so what are people doing? They are local. We have wonderful local initiatives like this one, the study of the Odessa historical and cultural myth that is supported by European Union and UNESCO that tried to look at what is the understanding of the myth among the locals in the city, among the intellectual community, and what we can do, what are the problematic things and what are the constructive things in the existing myth that we can build on. We also have, next slide, a wonderful Odessa decolonization project. I mean, this is, it exists on Instagram and it has this wonderful AI animation. For example, Yevhen Chikolenko, one of the great Ukrainian entrepreneurs and supporters of Ukrainian culture, he lived in Odessa for a while. So they have an AI animated Chikolenko scolding his descendants for forgetting the glorious Ukrainian history of Odessa and telling them that they need to dig deeper. Wonderful video. You can find it on the Instagram page. We also have an excellent example in the wonderful essay from Odessa, a writer and intellectual Zoya Kazanzhy, whose name alone is an epitome of the city's diversity. Greek first name, Turkish last name, Ukrainian by identification and culture. And of course, the title, Хто такі одесити і чого ми хочемо? So direct reference to Грушевський, Хто такі українці і чого вони хочуть. Грушевський was explaining it to the outsiders. Kazanzhy is both trying to talk to the outsiders and to the Odessans inside the city. Odessans ourselves, we too need to figure out what do we want. We need to critically address our past. And to help critically address our past, we can go beyond literature, which is the main source of the Russian imperialist mythology, and look at visual arts. Odessa is one of the main centers historically of nonconformist visual art in Ukraine. On the left, you see a painting from the 1960s by Yuri Yegorov, who was the leader of Odessa nonconformist artists, which is just called Noontime in August. And this is Odessa at its epitome. All the people say that Odessa is its most Odessan in August, when the sea is warm, where the fruit and vegetables are plentiful, but it also gets very hot in the middle of the day. So it's like the rest of the Mediterranean region, siesta, everything hides and it looks empty. So we have also these washed out colors and the same vernacular architecture. On the right, you see playing with the imperial symbols and myth. So we have the opera house floating on an allegorical island. So we have like an 18th century allegorical landscape painting, so disrupting the expectations. This is a painting by the late Alexander Roydburg. And of course, we have great scholarly projects, like the book Cosmopolitan Spaces in Odessa, where Professor Petrovsky-Shtern is one of the contributors with wonderful article on Vladimir Zayev-Zhabotinsky and his vision of Ukrainian-Jewish collaboration. Also, wonderful article by Alexander Zabirko, which is the best work in any language on the Odessan text in Ukrainian literature. And a very good article also by Emilia Glazer and Boris Khersonsky and his disconstruction of the city myth. And just as an example, here is Khersonsky, who is a noted clinical psychologist and also a poet and prose writer. On the left, you see his book in Russian, Odessa Intelligentsia, with illustrations by Roydburg that subverts and explodes, ironically, the old Odessa myth. On the right, you see his book of poetry in Ukrainian, which is a defiant confrontation with the enduring old stereotypes. We also have wonderful works of prose, Ivan Kozlenko's Tanger, which I promised the author I will translate into English in the copious amount of free time that I have. So I feel a little guilty because the book was published in 2017 and I haven't started yet, but I promise I will. It's a great novel, which is also a wonderful intertextual work, because what it does, it plays with Yuri Yanovsky's Meister Korabля, a great 1920s Ukrainian novel set in Odessa. And it has this wonderful intertextual play, which is structurally similar to Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which interacts with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And we, of course, have similar examples earlier in Ukrainian literature when Valerian Pitmahilny, in his Misto of the city, took the basic structure of Maupassant's Bel Ami and transferred it to 1920s Kiev. And Tanger is the symbol of freedom there. That's why there's such provocative, unusual title. And also it's a book that hybridizes, that it makes us ask questions, that precludes easy, facile sort of falling into stereotyping, and makes the unglamorous the centered and the important. And the most recent wonderful novel that I'd strongly recommend is Nina Kuryata's Dzvinka, subtitled Ukrainka Narodzhena v SSR, a Ukrainian born in the USSR, which also gives a wonderful perspective on the city from a point of view of a Ukrainian-speaking, ethnically Ukrainian, socially conscious, but diversity-embracing young person. The protagonist is, and it's a semi-autobiographical novel, was born in Lubashivka, a small town north of Odessa on the Odessa-Kyiv highway, but when she is 8 years old, her family moves to Odessa, but she's so conscious and strong and happy and settled in her Ukrainian identity that despite all the abuse and jokes, nasty jokes that she experienced, she survives as a strong person and remains a strong, conscious Ukrainian, and that lesson of strength is hugely important. And to me, it's what is wonderful that it's both a Bildungsroman, that is a book of education, but also a testimony. But a testimonial is a Latin American genre when you speak not only about your own experiences, but you testify as a representative of a community. Let's say I'm a Mayan woman from Guatemala. And when I'm speaking not just about my personal experience, but other people with identities like mine experience. This is very much what Kuryata's Dzvinka does. And so we have now a remarkable new, rich diversity of new representations of Odessa happening. So I think we can finally bury the old myth of Odessa of Russian imperialist origin and start looking at that city as a wonderful, diverse, and friendly space. And I thank you for your patience.
Professor Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern is next. I have, as the new president, we thought it was allowed 22 minutes, but
Sorry.
but I think it was a very interesting talk. We appreciate it, and we look forward to the other talks. 15 minutes.
Okay. I promised to abuse the mic, and that's what I'm doing right now. This book that I'm presenting today is the result of a struggle, of a fight, and of a number of catastrophes that happened to my colleagues, to me, and to people in Ukraine and in Israel. I was supposed to write a chapter for this book, which I did, on the usages of Jewish themes in the works, in the poetry, prose, and essays of Vasil Machno. And I did that. And I submitted the book, submitted my article in October last year to my colleague Zeev Hanin, who needs a very brief introduction. Zeev Hanin is born in Zaporizhia. He got his PhD from the University of Oxford in African Studies, and he became in Israel the chief specialist at the Ministry of Absorption. So if anybody knows anything about Israelis coming in and out of the country, if anybody knows anything about Jews migrating toward or outside of the state of Israel, this is person number one on the list. So I'm submitting the article, and October 7th comes. Zeev calls me October 8th and says, Yohanan, I am 4 times a day on the TV, and I am writing every day, as Motil writes his short essays for The Hill and other venues. The same is life for Zeev Hanin. He's writing for Haaretz, for Ma'ariv, for Yediot Ahronot, for all Israeli newspapers, and he's also on radio, explaining to the world what happened on October 7th in Israel. And he says, I cannot get the book together. So what he does after October 7th, he sends me 16 or 17 chapters. They are not numbered here. And he says, Yohanan, it's your work to do the work. So, the Gerüter, I usually prefer to deal with university publishers, and the more mainstream, the better, because they have very good copy editors. So here I have to deal with the Gerüter, who is at the same time getting together with Oldenburg publishers. So there is also a merge of the publishers. So there is merge of the editors, there is merge of the publishers. Everything is in flux, and I have to produce the book and get it done by June of the next year. Many articles are not translated from Russian and Ukrainian into English. And I have to very seriously look what is in the articles, because most of the articles were written by people who looked at the Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union, mainly that are linked to or placed in the Russian Federation. And I wanted to make the book more balanced. So I commissioned the article from a person who did Belarusian Jewry, a person who did Moldovan Jewry, a person who did Jews in Königsberg, Kaliningrad, a person who did Jews in Birobidzhan. And also I wanted to make sure that Ukraine is formidably represented in the book. So the first part of the book has a chapter written by the person who edited one of the most important Jewish journals, newspapers in Ukraine, about the role of newspapers in the making of the Jewish community in post-communist world after 1991, Michael Gold. Then the second part of the book has two chapters on Ukrainian Jewish community. The third part of the book has my chapter on Vasyl Makhno and the chapter by Serhiy Kravtsov, a famous scholar of architecture and art from Lviv, now in Israel, about the space of synagogues in Lviv, how the memory is celebrated by the urban community, which is non-Jewish, but which is trying to co-opt Jewish memory and make it very much part of modern city. And the last part also has a very interesting chapter by Igor Shchupak from Dnipro, who talks about the revisiting of the Holocaust studies in Ukrainian education. So the book is done. I wrote the preface, and then the publisher tells me, Yohanan, in the contract, we have Zev, Hanin, and you as authors of the preface. So we have to put the second name. Okay, so whatever. I need to brag. Sometimes I need to complain. So the preface, which is written from the first to the last line by your most humble, who is not humble though, is actually signed by two people. But what can I not do for my person for my colleague who is in distress in Israel? I do that for him. So this is how the book was put together. And in the preface, I am talking about several stages of the development of Jewish communities in general, and more focused with more zoomed in look at what is going on in Ukraine right before 1991 and after 1991 until today. So I'm not discussing the entire modification of the Jewish community, but I am focusing on certain stages and certain important paragraphs, of which I would mention only 5 and very briefly. Number 1, the Ukrainian government immediately before the August events of 1991 and collapse of communism and collapse of the Soviet Union chose the path to show the West that new Ukraine has nothing to do with the Soviet-style anti-Semitism. And this was done in a very formidable way. And I need to say that Kravchuk really did what none of the leaders of the post-communist state did in order to prove that Ukraine would not kowtow to the Cold War era anti-Semitism. 2, also Ukrainian authorities immediately after 1991 decided to acknowledge partially the responsibility of Ukrainians for allowing Germans to murder Jews en masse on its territory. It was a contentious issue then. It is a contentious issue now. I'm ready to answer your questions if you have. But Kravchuk in Knesset in Israel, at the meetings of the Rada, and publicly by going to Babin Yar Memorial in 1991 and onward, said that we will consider the Holocaust as Ivan Dzyuba considered it in his famous speech in 1966. That is to say, the Holocaust on the Ukrainian lands is what happened to Ukrainians, and not only to the Jews on Ukrainian lands. That was kind of a revolutionary revision of how Ukrainians treated their own history at that time. 3, already late in the 1980s, the Ukrainian secret services and politicians who were close to Ruch decided that one of the first things that they would do once Ukraine becomes independent, they will reestablish diplomatic relations with Israel. Israel was persona non grata in the Soviet Union and in Soviet Ukraine. Perhaps who lived in the Soviet Ukraine remember that all the newspapers that were circulating in Ukraine, Komsomolskaya Pravda, Trud, Izvestia, and also local newspapers, especially Вечерний Kyiv, were phenomenally anti-Israeli minded, and the caricatures showing Israeli leaders, with racially stereotyped, appeared practically in every edition of the newspaper. So the idea was among the newly rising Ukrainian elites that there would be normative diplomatic relations with Israel established. And that is also what happened immediately after 1991. I believe Yuri Shcherbak was the first ambassador sent by Ukraine to Israel. Yuri Shcherbak, as perhaps some of you know, is the leader of Ukrainian Green Party, a Ukrainian medical doctor, and one of the most important Ukrainian prose writers in the 1970s, 1980s. 4. Something interesting happened within the Jewish community in Ukraine that was also replicated in other parts of the former Soviet Union, but it had a very interesting flavor in Ukraine. My colleague Zeev Khalin, with whom I co-edited the book, wrote an article entitled "The Rabbinic Revolution in Ukraine." What I would say is that before 1991, the religious life in Ukraine, the life that we call in the United States the communal life, was very carefully supervised by the KGB. To give you one example, the KGB dorm was one house away from the only operating synagogue in Kiev. So, the gabbai of the synagogue in Kiev, gabbai means the person who is supervising the attendance, who is distributing the prayer shawls, books, and so on and so forth. That gabbai was what they call a stool pigeon of the corresponding organizations. So suddenly there appeared 25, 30, 35, 40 rabbinic scholars in Ukraine. And they came from all sorts of trends and denominations of Judaism from throughout the world. Rabbi Baksht, who is a typical Litvak traditional Ashkenazi Jew, came to Odessa and established the biggest in Europe orphanage for Jewish kids in Odessa. Rabbi Moskovitz came to Kharkiv, and he is a representative of Chabad Judaism. Rabbi Yaakov Bleich came from Brooklyn, and he represents Karlin Stolin trend in Judaism, and yada yada yada. I can identify all these rabbinic scholars and rabbis who came to start the communities from scratch. And what they did, they built the entire communal infrastructure, relying on people who were helping them and who re-identify themselves as Jews. And that brings me to the 5th point, the statistics. I believe it was either Bismarck or Benjamin Disraeli who were saying that there are 5 types of lie, and number 1 is statistics. So just to illustrate this point, I'll tell you that I spoke to the mayor of Kharkiv in 1992, and I asked him, how many Jews are there in the city. He said, well, before 1989, there was the famous last Soviet census, 1989. So he says, we had officially about 46,000 Jews in Kharkiv, which is a very low number. Then he says about 25,000 Jews left between, so from 1989 till 1992. Right now, we have 87,000 Jews. So what does it mean? That shows that many Jews in the former Soviet Union did whatever they could to conceal their Jewish identity. So if you have your grandfather or grandmother or father or mother who is not Jewish, the idea was that you have to have your Russian passport or Ukrainian passport, as you perhaps know, in the Soviet passport, number 5 paragraph identified you ethnically, right? So it's not like in the United States. What is your identity? I'm a U.S. citizen. No, in the Soviet Union, you had the 5th paragraph, and also there was a famous idiom that somebody is limping on the 5th paragraph, meaning that you have a Jewish passport. So you walk like that. Okay. So kulhavy na p'яту графу. So many people, including your most humble, were choosing their Ukrainian passports, Russian passports, whatever, to conceal their Jewish identity. The friend of the friend of the family, Vadim Skorotivsky, one of the leading Ukrainian intellectuals in the 1970s, 1980s, very close friend of my deceased father, spoke to me for half a year because I told him, no, I'm going to have a Jewish passport because my both parents are Jewish, but my mother had a Ukrainian passport. He said, no, no, no. If you want to get to if you want to get to this university, that university, you must have a Ukrainian passport. And basically, he told me, "Ne pluj v dinozaura." Okay, that's how I got to the most prestigious department of Kyiv University, Romano Hromadski Fakultet. Okay, we make our choices. So that is my fifth point. People started to appear from the blue with the new identity. They were no more ashamed of being Jewish, and being Jewish even became, I would say, fashionable. And suddenly people realized they have a Jewish grandfather, Jewish grandmother, and they started to identify themselves as Jews. That's the reason for the mayor of Kharkiv to say, that 46 minus 25 will be 87. Okay, 1,000 people who are identified as Jews in the post-Soviet Union reality. So this is 5 points of the preface that has more, especially about Western organizations and relations of Ukraine with the Western organizations that also changed the dynamic between the Jewish community and Ukrainian new state and people who were responsible for the building of the new state. If I have 3 minutes, if I may, I would like to give a little bit of a personal flavor to that dry talk. Do I have these?
Well, you're exactly at 15, but like.
Okay, let's vote.
We
I
can
just-
go 5 minutes over.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to tell you that not only the relations between the state and Jewish minority changed, but the relations of Jews, including Jews who had nothing to do genealogically with Ukrainians also changed. And I cannot, I cannot finish this conversation without telling you a story that happened to me. So I knew nothing about Jewish legacy in Ukraine, but I was active as a translator from Hebrew to Russian, Hebrew to Ukrainian from 1992. And I was traveling with a rabbi, any rabbi in Shalom Aleichem is called Menachem Mendel, but I actually traveled with a rabbi whose name was Menachem Mendel, and he was a Yiddish and Hebrew speaking person who was interested in the what they call in Hebrew kivrei tzadikim, the grave sites of the righteous people, mostly the founders of different Hasidic dynasties. And he took me to Medjugorje to see the grave site of Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, to Uman to see the grave site of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, and to Berdichev to see the grave site of the Vysocko of Berdichev, and so on and so forth. So through his eyes, I was discovering the Jewish past of Ukraine. But I was also discovering the Jewish understanding of Ukrainian things through his eyes. He was a very curious person, ultra-Orthodox Jew, who told me, Yohanan, I would like to see some sort of Ukrainian culture. Take me to the opera house. I'm saying, there are women who are singing. It's forbidden for a Jew to see a woman who is singing. He says, but they are in the wigs. Okay, so I'm looking at the list of things that are available at the Opera House early in September 1993, and lo and behold, what is the first opera? Taras Bulba. So can you imagine? I'm taking a person who has a strimal, fur hat, and he has short black pants and white socks. So he's dressed like a 17th century person from somewhere in Holland, and he is not changing his suit if he goes to Opera House. So I'm taking him to Opera House to watch Taras Bulba. He sits next to me. We are in the box, and I'm explaining to him what's going on the stage. So, and everybody knows Taras Bulba. I don't need to tell you what's going on the stage. So at a certain point, Andriy is marrying a Polish lady, and there is a kostol on the stage, and they are singing, and they marry, and at that point, Menachem Mendel already is identifying himself with Taras Bulba, and he is absolutely scandalized by a person who is marrying out, who is, this Orthodox person who is marrying out. So I explained to him, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, so he is marrying this Polish Catholic girl. What? He is marrying a Goya? So that was the moment when I realized there is a chance, there is a good chance that there will be people in Israel, traditional Jewish culture, Ukrainian Jews who would identify with the Ukrainian plight. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll stand. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Although I've been a member of Tashav for probably 30 years or so, this is the first board meeting I've ever been to. So I'm sort of an old new voice. So I thought I would perhaps also introduce myself along with my research. I'm a historical anthropologist, and anthropology is a rapidly growing field within Ukrainian studies. But it's really important to take stock of where we've come. When I applied to graduate school at Columbia up the road in 1989, I said I wanted to do research in Brazil. And I said that even though I was already then interested in Ukraine because I had studied abroad in the USSR as an undergraduate. And I understood the imbalance in the way, largely in the West, one perceived the USSR in this not only very Russo-centric, but even Moscow-centric kind of a way. And I understood that was highly problematic. But 1989 was quite a pivotal year, if you remember. And so by the time then I did start at Columbia, I had tossed Brazil in my plans for studying Candomblé right out the window, and then switched to studying Ukraine. And that's where my research has kept me for 30 some odd years at this point. I've always taken my topics from Ukrainians, from my work in the field. And that's why about 25 years ago, I turned to the field of religion, and in particular, the politics of religion, and specifically dynamics of belonging. What makes a person feel that they belong to a particular community or to a particular nation? I guess it's quite similar to what you were just hearing about. And I've looked at different confessional traditions, and although I continue to follow religion, and in particular the role of religion in terms of building social cohesion, and I'm doing that in part in a role that I have now at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I'm still affiliated with Penn State, still a professor, but I'm also the senior advisor responsible for the Ukraine portfolio at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And so in that capacity, since 2018, I've been working on issues of how religious actors, religious institutions can contribute to conflict mediation. And so I've seen then an arc of changes from looking at conflicts that were very much on the local level, very adversarial, usually with state entities, to now, of course, conflicts and mediation attempts among the Orthodox churches themselves. Increasingly also, I'm working on issues of how to coordinate trauma healing and psychosocial support, as they call it, within Ukraine for the burgeoning mental health issues, as well as how religious institutions can be a positive force in terms of distributing humanitarian aid. So my work on religion and following both the contemporary how the historic and the contemporary continues to intersect in Ukraine and continues to contribute to politics in Ukraine. Although that's a long-standing interest of mine, war often prompts us to think and do unexpected things, and that's been the case for me as well. I began to think about moral commitments and the ethics of care. Those are long-standing religious kind of issues, and to think about how to deter war. And one way to deter war, it occurred to me, was to make it that much more punishing for those who wage it. And so I'm now working on ecocide and trying to mount a legal case to prosecute the Russian state for the environmental damage it has inflicted on Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. So to pursue this, I began to think about what would happen if we began to think about how animals experience war. We know a fair amount about how humans experience it, but I wonder if it's any different for animals. Where I began to think about how might our assessment as to what constitutes a just war, and in particular, especially at this point, what constitutes a just peace, if one began to take into consideration the rights of nature and animal rights, and to think in terms of reparations for the aftermath of war that would include not just rebuilding infrastructure, building schools and the like, but also restoring clean air, clean water, clean land. So I hope, nonetheless, to mount this case for ecocide and to do it by ushering forth what war looks and feels like to animals. I got this idea when, of course, I, like so many others, saw so many Ukrainian refugees fleeing Ukraine with their pets in tow. If you remember, there were dogs, cats. I mean, literally that event changed the delivery of humanitarian aid. Going forward, I don't think there will be, whether it's man-made or a natural disaster, humanitarian responses now that don't include attention to pets, and that is thanks to the Russo-Ukrainian war and Ukrainian refugees who showed up with everything from turtles to guinea pigs to cats to dogs to horses and all kinds of other four-legged friends. That got me thinking about the extent to which we very often have more empathy for animals and animal suffering. It's not that I'm exclusively focused on that at the expense of people, but I just think that by focusing on animals and the empathy that animals engender, the kind of stories, getting away from statistics, but the kind of stories and emotional reactions, that is one way to begin to communicate the egregious crimes that have been committed against ecosystems in Ukraine. And it's my hope, of course, that people realize that those very animals, of course, share the same land, water, and air with people. In my book, I'm looking at 4 different kinds of animals: companion animals, livestock, wildlife, and zoo animals. And of course, it's when one looks at companion animals, the more I got into this topic, I realized Ukrainians themselves use animals to present themselves to themselves and to the outside world. Just recall the use of kitties as a way of presenting Ukrainian soldiers, as well as the heroic efforts that have gone into saving even individual animals. Like one of the more famous is Shevchenko, the cat, who was found after 60 days. Talk about Ukrainian resilience. It goes down to the felines. 60 days, no water, no food, and on a blown out building. She was trapped on the 7th floor. But really Herculean efforts went into saving that cat and into saving a multitude of other kinds of animal life. And I think for Ukrainians, that was a way of projecting who they are. Every life matters, and there's a certain dignity to life. And I believe that message was really picked up and reflected in media. So companion animals reflect that. Zoo animals was also fascinating to the extent that, well, for starters, I realized the extent to which we have a lot of private zoos in Ukraine. When you have fairly porous borders and a poorly regulated state, people who have the means can have a leopard or a tiger, what have you. But nonetheless, there's zoo animals reflect basically our own system of migration. Some animals are allowed to move and some are not. So zoo animals in that sense, there's associations among zoos that do allow for the transport of, let's say, big cats. And big cats were, once again, Herculean efforts went into saving these big cats, who were then subsequently found in apartments, in the Kiev metro, and in all kinds of other places before they could be relocated to sanctuaries. And in particular, a lot of this kind of tremendous rescue work is done by women. In the same breath, there are all kinds of animals, from zoos to livestock to wildlife, of course, where there's no means of evacuating them. And so you see when the stark disparities there. Looking at livestock and wildlife, that becomes then an indirect means of documenting environmental harm. One of the, can you not hear?
Yeah, I have a question. You categorize these animals. What category would be like domestic pigs eating Russian dead soldiers? Which category they are?
Oh,
Well, pigs I would consider livestock, but
No, because they let the livestock because the horse left building, so they become nobody's left. They become
right.
like,
Actually, on that note, I do have to say that out of all the categories, livestock were really the most vulnerable. I was kind of unprepared for that because livestock generally have commercial value, but
I'm sorry, we are not yet to the questions and
Right.
answers.
Yes,
Please hold on, bear with
because we're
us.
under time constraints too. I understand I'm the one standing between you and a reception, so. Let me also, so in terms of making a case for ecocide, there are several problems. I'll focus only on two. Obviously, if one goes to a court of law, you need really firm evidence data and laboratory proven samples. So of course, both collecting that material is extraordinarily dangerous and difficult today, especially with energy outages and the like. And so I've worked with Ukrainians who are doing that very difficult work, as well as EPA officials who have been sent to Ukraine to assist in that and to verify the results. But a lot of the collecting data is very difficult and in a great many instances, we don't have reliable before and after kind of samples to prove the case. So that's why the harm that is inflicted on livestock and wildlife becomes an indirect way. I mean, that harm didn't exist earlier and exists now. Another big issue is, of course, mines. The mines block gathering of data, but they also indirectly indicate where they are. And once again, it's very often livestock and wildlife who are the victims in that sense. Still, I really do think that it's very likely, and certainly I'm going to continue to try to mount this case for ecocide. I take heart from Philip Sands, who is one of the main architects of ecocide legislation. And he at one point pointed to the importance of having single moments of horror. I think we can agree there have been multiple moments of horror, but of course, certainly the exploding of the Kakhovka Dam on June 6th of last year, 2023, I think is really of colossal importance. And although we have issues with data collection, and the fact that there have been no new introduction of war crimes since the end of World War II, and growing concerns about crafting legislation that does not conflate corporate or accidents with intentionally inflicted environmental harm. I'm still optimistic that we will have legislation in the sense of an international war crime. But even barring that, it's important to note that Ukraine itself, in its own criminal code, has ecocide enshrined, and they consider ecocide the mass destruction of flora, fauna, pollution of the atmosphere or water resources, as well as other actions that can cause an environmental catastrophe. So while for the moment there is no legal mechanism under international criminal law that can be used to protect the environment, it already exists on a countrywide level. And so it's that kind of attempt of both bringing this war to a more speedy end, inflicting punishments on those who wage war, especially war that inflicts that kind of long-lasting damage to the environment. That is, of course, what motivates me to carry on with this research. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity to once again welcome the new board of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. I am very sort of excited and moved really by all of your presentations and the level that we are introducing to the society. And I want to wish this board very well. This is an abridged session, so unfortunately we are not going to have a question and answer period. However, we are inviting everyone for dinner upstairs and for the opportunity which you will have to meet with our members, and please voice all your questions to the speakers when you speak.
One
Yes,
second.
absolutely.
As you know, perhaps, in the 19th century, there was a group of intellectuals in Galicia who were supporting not pro-Austrian, but pro-Russian influence in Galicia. They were called Moscophili. So this is the name I would give to the pigs who eat Russian soldiers.
Thank you so much to our speakers, and I wish you a wonderful 3 years at the helm of this organization. It was very, very exciting.